Hello there, my nighttime companions. Welcome to Sleep with the Fishes, where we dive into the shadowy world of organized crime, weaving tales of intrigue, power, and the complex web of loyalty and betrayal. As you settle in for the night, let these stories of notorious figures and legendary heists guide you into a restful slumber. Before we embark on tonight's journey through the underworld, I invite you to join our growing family by subscribing and liking the video. Your support helps us continue crafting these captivating tales that lull you to sleep. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's explore the hidden corners of the criminal world together. Sweet dreams, and remember, in the world of crime, nothing is ever as it seems. Tonight, we are not traveling to the familiar cobblestones of Sicily, nor the bustling concrete canyons of New York City. Our journey takes us somewhere different, to a land of stark beauty, of dust and sun, a place where power was built not always with the loud report of a gunshot, but often with the quiet whisper of a conversation, with a handshake in a shaded courtyard. We are traveling to Mexico to explore the life of a man who was less a gangster and more an architect. Before the names that dominate modern headlines, there was a quiet, calculating presence who transformed a scattered collection of smugglers into a unified corporate empire. His name was Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, and his story is a lesson in a different kind of power. So relax, close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and let your mind drift back in time. We are going to a place and an era where the lines between law and lawlessness were as blurred as a desert horizon in the midday heat. This is the story of the man they called El Padrino, the Godfather, the quiet diplomat of a rising cartel empire. Part 1. The Shadow Diplomat. Early life and political ties. Imagine, if you will, the state of Sinaloa in the mid-20th century. Picture a vast landscape cradled by the formidable Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains to the east, and kissed by the warm waters of the Gulf of California to the west. This is a land of contrast, of fertile river valleys that give way to arid, sun-baked plains. The air itself feels different here, thick with the scent of damp earth after a rare rain, the sweet perfume of bougainvillea, and the ever-present dusty tang of the dry soil. The rhythm of life in the 1940s and 50s was dictated by the seasons. For most, existence was a cycle of planting and harvesting. Corn, beans, tomatoes. These were the currencies of daily life. It was a life of hard work, of rising with the sun and resting only when it dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. It was a life deeply connected to the land, but it was also, for many, a life of profound scarcity. It was into this world on April 24, 1946, that Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was born, just outside the city of Culiacán. He was born into a family of ranchers, not destitute, but far from the echelons of wealth. From his earliest days, he was surrounded by this reality. The constant, quiet struggle against the elements, against poverty, against the limitations of fate. Unlike the stereotype of the hot-headed outlaw, those who remember Felix Gallardo's youth describe a boy who was markedly different. He was not loud or boisterous or known for fights in the village square. He was observant, quiet, possessed of a sharp, analytical intelligence that was always working behind his calm eyes. He was a watcher, a listener. He learned early on that more could be gained by understanding the dynamics of a situation than by trying to force it. He watched the merchants in the market, the ranchers making deals, the local officials who held sway over the small communities. He was a student of human nature, learning the subtle language of power, of debt, of obligation. For a young man like Felix, intelligent and ambitious, the paths out of a life of ranching were few. He was tall, composed, and carried himself with an air of authority that belied his humble origins. The most visible and structured path to a different life was law enforcement. And so, as a young man, he joined the Sinaloa State Police. Imagine yourself now, putting on that uniform for the first time. In the Mexico of that era, a police badge was not just a symbol of justice. It was a key. It unlocked doors. It granted access. It was an entry pass into the real machinery of society. For Felix Gallardo, it was the perfect university. His work as a police officer was not about high-speed chases or dramatic shootouts. It was about learning the intricate, unwritten rules of his home state. He learned which politicians were on the rise, which families held generational influence, and most importantly, he learned about the shadow economy that thrived just beneath the surface. Sinaloa had long been a cradle of smuggling. Its rugged, inaccessible mountains were ideal for cultivating marijuana and the opium poppy, far from the prying eyes of the federal government. For generations, this trade had been a part of life, a dangerous but profitable alternative to subsistence farming. As a police officer, Felix Gallardo learned the roots. He learned the names of the growers in the highlands, and he learned how protection money flowed from the shadows into the hands of those in power. He saw that the true power wasn't in enforcing the law, but in managing it. His quiet competence, his intelligence, and his imposing physical presence did not go unnoticed. He was soon recommended for a position far more influential than that of a simple patrolman. He became a family bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sanchez Celis. This was the moment his life pivoted. This was his entry into the inner sanctum. Let your mind paint the picture. A sprawling governor's mansion with cool, tiled floors and shaded courtyards. The quiet clinking of ice in a glass during a late afternoon meeting. The low murmur of conversations about contracts, political favors, and business deals. And in the corner of the room, standing silently, is Felix Gallardo. He is a part of the scenery, a shadow on the wall. But he is listening, always listening. As the personal guard to a powerful and notoriously corrupt governor, Felix Gallardo received an education that no university could offer. He saw firsthand how political power and illicit wealth were two sides of the same coin. He learned that a friendly conversation with the right person was worth more than a dozen armed men. He learned how to speak the language of influence, to navigate the delicate ecosystem of favors and threats that kept the entire structure running. He was no longer just a police officer. He was an apprentice to the masters of the game. It was during this time that he began to see the inefficiency, the fragmentation of the smuggling world. The growers in the mountains, the small-time traffickers in the towns, the corrupt officials. They all operated in their own little orbits. They were often at odds with one another, competing, squabbling over territory and profits. There was no system, no grand strategy. Felix Gallardo, the quiet observer, saw an opportunity, not for chaos, but for order. His transition from the governor's bodyguard to a trafficker in his own right was not a sudden leap, but a gradual, calculated drift. He never truly left the world of connections and influence he had cultivated. Instead, he leveraged it. His word carried the implicit backing of his powerful patron. His time in the police force gave him an intimate knowledge of the state's security apparatus. He didn't need to kick down doors. He already had the keys. He began to use his unique skills not to intimidate, but to mediate, to organize. He approached the disparate players in the Sinaloan drug trade not as a rival, but as a potential partner, a problem solver. He could guarantee safe passage for their product. He could negotiate with officials on their behalf. He could ensure that shipments moved smoothly, that payments were made on time. He was, in essence, offering a service. Stability. He was the shadow diplomat. He built bridges of trust, greased with the money from the burgeoning trade, but reinforced by his reputation for being a man of his word. A man who was calm, serious, and thought 10 steps ahead. It was in this period that he formed the relationships that would become the foundation of his future empire. He worked with men like Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Nato, an old-school trafficker with deep roots and extensive knowledge of the smuggling business. And he partnered with a younger, more audacious figure, Rafael Caro Quintero, a brilliant and ambitious farmer from the mountains who was revolutionizing marijuana cultivation. Together, they formed a triumvirate of talent. Don Neto brought the experience, Caro Quintero brought the high-quality product, and Felix Gallardo brought the system. He was the architect, the strategist, the diplomat, who could connect their growing operation to the corridors of power he knew so well. He preferred a negotiation to a confrontation, a bribe to a bullet. He understood that violence was messy, unpredictable, and bad for business. It drew attention. His approach was a quiet revolution. He was building the framework, laying the groundwork for something Mexico had never seen before. He was not just moving product across a border. He was creating a vertically integrated organization, all while maintaining the serene, untouchable facade of a legitimate businessman and a man with powerful friends. The sun would set over Culiacan, and in the quiet of the evening, deals were struck, alliances were forged, and the foundations of an invisible empire were cemented, not with blood and terror, but with handshakes, mutual interests, and the quiet, calculating vision of the man who stood at its center. The shadow diplomat was just getting started. The next step was to move from organizing a state to engineering a nationwide cartel. Part 2. The cartel engineer, building the Guadalajara empire. Continuity. It is a powerful force in business and in life. The foundation that Felix Gallardo had carefully laid in Sinaloa was strong. He had proven his model, that cooperation, backed by high-level political protection, was infinitely more profitable than chaotic competition. But Sinaloa was merely the prototype. It was the testing ground. Felix's vision extended far beyond the borders of his home state. He saw a much larger machine, a national enterprise, and he knew he was the only one with the blueprint and the patience to build it. To understand the genius of his next move, you must first understand the landscape of the trade in Mexico at the time. Imagine the long 2,000-mile border between Mexico and the United States. This border was not one single entity. It was a series of distinct territories, or plazas: Tijuana, Mexicali, Ciudad Juarez, Nuevo Laredo. Each was its own kingdom, controlled by a specific family or a local strongman. These plaza bosses were the gatekeepers. If you wanted to move any illicit product north, you had to go through them. And for this service, they charged a tax, a fee known as piso. They were, in effect, a collection of feudal lords, each controlling a vital bridge or port, and each fiercely protective of their own small piece of the pie. This system was the biggest impediment to growth. It was inefficient. It led to turf wars, double crosses, and unpredictable losses. A trafficker could successfully move a shipment hundreds of miles from the south, only to have it seized or stolen at the final hurdle by a competing plaza boss. Felix Gallardo looked at this patchwork of warring fiefdoms and saw not a series of threats, but a grand logistical problem in need of an elegant solution. He envisioned a federation, a national unified consortium. He saw a future where the plaza bosses were not competitors, but partners, board members in a grand enterprise, with him as the chief executive officer. To achieve this, he, along with his partners Don Nato and Caro Quintero, made a strategic relocation. They moved their base of operations from the familiar rural territory of Culiacan to Mexico's second-largest city, Guadalajara. Imagine this transition, leaving behind the dusty streets and ranching culture for the cosmopolitan air of a major metropolis. Guadalajara in the early 1980s was a city of sophistication and progress. It had modern banks, international airports, advanced communications, and a thriving social scene. Here, a man of immense wealth could blend in. He could be a cattle baron, a real estate developer, a respected industrialist. The city itself provided a cloak of legitimacy, allowing Felix to operate on a level previously unimaginable. From his new headquarters, he began his work as the great unifier. He arranged a series of meetings, an event now legendary in the history of the underworld, sometimes referred to as the Acapulco Summit. One by one, he brought the heads of the major plazas to the table. The Arellano Felix family from Tijuana, the Carrillo Fuentes family from Juarez, and others. Picture these meetings. They were not scenes of intimidation, with armed guards pacing nervously. They were business negotiations, held in the quiet privacy of luxury hotels or secluded ranches. Felix Gallardo, always calm, always impeccably dressed, would lay out his proposition. His argument was one of pure, undeniable business logic. He would tell them to imagine a future where they no longer had to fight each other for scraps. A future where their territories were respected, guaranteed. He would handle the most difficult part of the business, the top-level political protection. Using his connections that reached into the highest offices of Mexico's federal police and intelligence agencies, he could provide a blanket of immunity for the entire organization. In return, they would join his federation. They would still manage their plazas, their own territories, but they would do so as part of a coordinated effort. Logistics would be streamlined, prices would be controlled, and profits, he argued, would be beyond their wildest dreams. He was asking them to trade their volatile, hard-won independence for a stake in a secure and unimaginably wealthy corporation. Most, seeing the logic, agreed. The Guadalajara cartel was born. It was a federation with Felix Gallardo as its chairman. He was the engineer of a new system, one that prized efficiency and organization above all else. But just as his national machine was coming online, a geopolitical shift to the south would provide the fuel to make it one of the most powerful criminal enterprises on the planet. Thousands of miles away, in Colombia, the Medellin cartel, led by figures like Pablo Escobar, was facing a problem. They were producing vast quantities of high-purity cocaine, but their primary routes into the United States, through the Caribbean and Florida, were being systematically choked off by a massive influx of American law enforcement. The U.S. was winning the Battle of the Caribbean. Felix Gallardo saw their problem as his ultimate opportunity. He had what the Colombians desperately needed: a secure, efficient, and unified land bridge into the world's most lucrative market. He controlled the entire U.S.-Mexico border. He reached out and arranged a meeting. Imagine the scene: the quiet, calculating Mexican diplomat meeting with the notoriously flamboyant and violent Colombian narcos. The Colombians at first likely saw him as a simple mule, a transporter to be hired. They offered him cash for his services, thousands of dollars per kilogram moved. Felix, in a move of breathtaking audacity and foresight, refused the cash. He didn't want to be an employee. He wanted to be a partner. He explained that his payment would not be in dollars, but in product. For every 2 kilograms of cocaine he successfully transported into the United States, his organization would keep 1. He was asking for a 50% stake in the entire operation. It was an offer the Colombians, with their supply chains collapsing, could not refuse. The deal was struck, and with that handshake, the Guadalajara cartel was transformed. The organization that had been built on marijuana, a profitable but bulky product, was now the primary transportation service for the river of cocaine flowing north. The wealth that followed was staggering. It was beyond comprehension. And Felix Gallardo ran the entire operation like a Fortune 500 company. He was the CEO, the jefe de jefes, the boss of bosses. He focused on strategy and high-level government relations. His partners, Don Nato and Caro Quintero, were his chief operating officers. Don Nato managed relationships and logistics, while Caro Quintero oversaw the production side, which still included massive, technologically advanced marijuana plantations that were a marvel of illicit agriculture. The plaza bosses were his division heads, his regional managers. They were responsible for the day-to-day operations in their territories, ensuring the smooth flow of product across their section of the border. The cartel had departments: a logistics department with a fleet of aircraft, boats, and tractor-trailers, a sophisticated financial department dedicated to laundering billions of dollars through a web of legitimate businesses, restaurants, banks, construction companies, and of course, a security department, the enforcers who dealt with breaches of contract and external threats. But even this was managed with a corporate mentality. Violence was a tool, but a last resort. It was a failure of diplomacy, and Felix Gallardo did not like failure. He had engineered an empire, a multinational conglomerate built on a foundation of political corruption, diplomatic skill, and ruthless business acumen. It operated with a quiet, terrifying efficiency, its tentacles reaching from the poppy fields of the Sierra Madre to the highest levels of the Mexican government, and from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of every major American city. The cartel engineer had completed his masterpiece. The system was perfect, and at its peak, it was almost completely invisible to the outside world. Part 3. The Invisible Hand. Gallardo's peak influence. Power, in its most refined form, is not seen. It is felt. It is an atmosphere, a pressure, a subtle shift in the dynamics of a room. A truly powerful man does not need to raise his voice. His presence alone is enough to command silence and attention. At the zenith of his influence, in the mid-1980s, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had achieved this ultimate form of power. He was no longer just a cartel leader. He was an invisible hand, shaping events, economies, and even governments from the deepest shadows. Imagine for a moment the sheer scale of the Guadalajara cartel's operations. Billions of dollars were flowing from the United States back into Mexico, an amount of money so vast it becomes an abstraction, difficult to truly comprehend. This was not simply cash stuffed into bags. It was a force of nature, a financial river that had the power to erode the very bedrock of a nation's institutions. Felix Gallardo, the quiet architect, understood that this river of wealth needed to be channeled. His true genius was not just in trafficking, but in the masterful art of corruption. He had learned from his time as a governor's bodyguard that every official, no matter how powerful, had a price. His system of protection, which he had promised to the plaza bosses, was not a loose collection of bribes. It was a systematic, institutionalized network of complicity. Think of it as a corporate benefits program for the corrupt. He had on his payroll high-ranking commanders in the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, or DFS, Mexico's equivalent of the FBI. These were not just street-level cops. These were the men in charge of national security, the very people tasked with dismantling organizations like his. For them, loyalty to the government was a job. Loyalty to Felix Gallardo was a lucrative career path. They provided intelligence, they quashed investigations, and they used their official power to eliminate any of his smaller, unsanctioned rivals. His influence stretched into the Attorney General's office, into the military, and into the governor's mansions of multiple states. A shipment of drugs moving north was not sneaking past the authorities. It was being escorted by them. A federal police vehicle might clear the path, its presence ensuring that no local, honest officer would dare to interfere. An army patrol would be instructed to be somewhere else when a plane laden with cocaine needed to land on a clandestine airstrip. The system was so deeply embedded that the lines between the cartel and the state became functionally non-existent in many regions. The government didn't just turn a blind eye. It was an active, compensated partner in the enterprise. This was the peace he offered, the Pax Sinaloa, a peace born of absolute control. For a time, the open warfare between traffickers that had once plagued the streets largely subsided. Under Felix's federation, there was order. Disputes were not settled with car bombs or public assassinations. They were brought to him, the chairman of the board. He would mediate, arbitrate, and his decision was final. He was the law in the underworld, his authority unquestioned, because everyone understood that to defy him was to defy the entire system, including the corrupt government officials who guaranteed its existence. And then there are the whispers, the stories that persist to this day, concerning an even more powerful, and more complex layer of protection. The stories of his connections to the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. To understand this, you must picture the political climate of the 1980s. The Cold War was in its final, intense chapter. The United States government was laser-focused on combating the spread of communism in Central America. The official enemy was the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The American allies were the anti-communist rebels, the Contras. The Contras needed money, and they needed weapons, and official channels for providing this support were often blocked by a wary U.S. Congress. It has been alleged by numerous journalists, former officials, and insiders that in this shadow war, the CIA was willing to make alliances of convenience. The allegation is this, that Felix Gallardo's vast transportation network, his fleet of aircraft flying north with drugs, was also used on the return journey. Flying south, the planes would allegedly carry weapons and cash destined for the Contras. In exchange for this logistical help, the story goes, the cartel was allowed to operate with a certain level of impunity from American law enforcement. We cannot know for certain the full truth of these allegations. They exist in a murky world of covert operations and classified documents. But imagine the sheer audacity of it. A man who had so mastered the art of corruption that he was not only being protected by the government he was undermining, but was also allegedly a paid contractor for the intelligence agency of the very country he was flooding with drugs. It speaks to a level of influence that is almost beyond belief. He was an invisible hand playing on a global chessboard. And what of the man himself? What was his life like at the peak of his power? Unlike the ostentatious displays of wealth favored by so many other kingpins, Felix Gallardo maintained his characteristic composure and quiet taste. He did not coat his life in gold. Instead, he cloaked it in the guise of old money and legitimate success. He owned sprawling haciendas, yes, but they were working ranches. He owned banks, construction firms, and currency exchange houses. He drove luxury cars, but they were discreet sedans, not flashy sports cars. His life was one of quiet, insulated luxury. Imagine him in the evenings, not in a loud nightclub, but in the study of one of his many homes. The room is paneled in dark wood, the air smelling of leather and old books. He is surrounded not by sycophants and bodyguards, but by accountants, lawyers, and businessmen. He pores over ledgers and stock reports, managing his vast portfolio with the same meticulous attention he gave to his illicit shipments. He had a family, children he doted on. To the outside world, to the high society of Guadalajara in which he moved, he was simply Don Miguel, a tremendously successful and well-connected businessman with a talent for making friends in high places. He was known for his calm demeanor, his generosity, and his sharp mind. The source of his incredible wealth was a subject of gossip, of course, but no one dared to speak of it openly. His power was so absolute, so protected, that it created its own reality. This was his kingdom. A kingdom built not on terror, but on control. A kingdom where violence was held in reserve, and where diplomacy, bribery, and ruthless efficiency were the tools of statecraft. He was the invisible hand, the CEO of an empire that was intertwined with the very fabric of the state. He moved with a quiet confidence, the confidence of a man who believed he had thought of everything, that he had controlled every variable, and that his carefully engineered machine was simply too big, too powerful, and too protected to ever fail. He had achieved a level of success that made him seem untouchable, a phantom ruling from the heart of Mexico. But even the most brilliant architect cannot account for every possibility. And a single, brutal act was about to bring the entire, magnificent structure crashing down. Part 4. The Death of Kiki and Collapse of a Kingdom. A system, no matter how perfectly designed, is still subject to the unpredictable nature of human emotion. Pride, anger, revenge. These are forces that can defy logic and unravel even the most meticulous plans. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had built an empire on a foundation of quiet control and rational self-interest. He had accounted for greed, for ambition, for the mechanics of corruption. But he had built this empire on a partnership with other men, men who did not always share his composure or his foresight. And there was one entity he could not bribe, could not control, and could not incorporate into his system: the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. In the early 1980s, the DEA had a small, determined office in Guadalajara. Working from this outpost was an agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena. He was intelligent, relentless, and deeply committed to his work. For years, he had been gathering intelligence, trying to map the invisible structure of Felix Gallardo's federation. He was a ghost, hunting a phantom, and he was getting closer. The catalyst for the collapse was rooted in the very success of the cartel. Rafael Caro Quintero, the agricultural genius of the trio, had established a marijuana plantation of a scale that was simply legendary. It was called Rancho Buffalo, a massive 1,000-hectare operation in the state of Chihuahua. It was not a simple farm. It was an agricultural city, employing thousands of laborers, with its own dormitories, irrigation systems, and security. It was the crown jewel of the cartel's marijuana business, a symbol of their untouchable power. In November of 1984, acting on intelligence provided by Kiki Camarena, the Mexican army, under immense pressure from the DEA, raided Rancho Buffalo. They destroyed the crop, burning thousands of tons of high-grade marijuana. The financial loss was immense, estimated in the billions of dollars. But the blow was more than financial. It was a profound public humiliation. Caro Quintero, fiery and proud, was enraged. In his mind, the raid was a direct result of the American agent, Camarena. The system of protection had failed, and in his anger, he demanded retribution. This was a critical moment. Felix Gallardo, the diplomat, the strategist, would have understood the catastrophic danger of directly confronting the United States. He would have known that killing a federal agent was crossing a line from which there was no return. But his federation was a partnership, and the fury of his partners, particularly Caro Quintero, created a momentum he could not or would not stop. The quiet calculus of business was about to be overwhelmed by a tide of raw emotion. On February 7th, 1985, as Kiki Camarena was leaving the American consulate in Guadalajara to meet his wife for lunch, he was abducted in broad daylight. He was surrounded, forced into a vehicle, and taken to a house owned by Caro Quintero. His pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avelar, was taken separately on the same day. The events that took place over the next 2 days in that house were a grim departure from the cartel's usual business practices. It was not a clean, swift act of violence. It was a brutal interrogation. Camarena was kept alive, his tormentors seeking to extract every piece of information he possessed about the DEA's operations and informants. The details are grim, a testament to the cruelty that lay dormant beneath the cartel's corporate facade. Lives were not just ended, they were brutally, methodically deconstructed. A month later, the bodies of Camarena and Zavala were found, wrapped in plastic, on a remote ranch. The invisible hand had finally shown its knuckles, and the response from the United States was swift, absolute, and utterly devastating. The American government launched Operation Leyenda, or Legend, the largest homicide investigation in the history of the DEA. The rage in Washington was palpable. The partnership with Mexico, which had been predicated on a certain level of deniability, was shattered. The United States put a level of pressure on the Mexican government that was unprecedented. They slowed traffic at the border to a crawl, creating economic chaos. They issued travel advisories. They made it clear in no uncertain terms that business as usual was over until those responsible for Camarena's murder were brought to justice. Felix Gallardo's greatest asset, his network of protection within the Mexican government, crumbled under this immense external force. The officials who had been on his payroll were now running for cover, terrified of American retribution. The system of immunity he had so carefully engineered was dissolving before his eyes. He became a fugitive in the empire he had built. He moved from safe house to safe house, watching as his partners, Don Neto and Caro Quintero, were inevitably captured. The plaza bosses, the regional managers of his great federation, saw the truth. The chairman of the board could no longer guarantee their security. The Pax Sinaloa was over. They broke away, retreating to their home territories, taking their logistics and their connections with them. The great unified cartel shattered into warring successor states: the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, the Sinaloa cartel. Felix Gallardo's fall from grace created the very chaos his rise had sought to prevent. For 4 years, he managed to evade capture, using the last vestiges of his influence. But his world had shrunk. He was a ghost, haunted by the consequences of a single, fatal miscalculation. The end, when it came, was not a blaze of glory. On April 8th, 1989, he was arrested quietly at a friend's home in Guadalajara. There was no shootout, no dramatic standoff. The architect of the most powerful criminal enterprise in Mexican history was taken into custody without a single shot being fired. The invisible hand was finally put in irons. He was convicted for the kidnapping and murder of Kiki Camarena, as well as for drug trafficking and a host of other crimes. He was sentenced to a long prison term, condemned to watch from behind bars as the unified kingdom he had built descended into decades of bloody, internecine warfare. The men who were once his lieutenants, El Chapo Guzman, the Arellano Felix brothers, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, would become the new, more violent kings, their wars staining the streets of Mexico with blood for a generation. And so, the story of the quiet architect comes to a close. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was a man of immense vision, a man who saw order in chaos and opportunity in fragmentation. He built an empire that was a marvel of dark efficiency, a testament to the power of organization and quiet influence. But his creation, born in the shadows, could not withstand the light. Its collapse unleashed a storm of violence that continues to rage to this day. His story is a quiet reminder that even the most carefully constructed systems are fragile, and that a legacy of order can sometimes give birth to an even greater legacy of chaos. But that story is over now. The echoes of that distant, turbulent world have faded. Let them drift away. You have journeyed far, back into a time of shadows and whispers, but the journey is complete. It is time to let go. Let go of the story. Let go of the day. Feel the last remnants of tension leaving your body, flowing out with each slow exhale. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Allow your mind to become as vast and as quiet as that desert sky. Allow yourself to drift, to float, to sink into a deep and truly restorative sleep accompanied by these gentle melodies. Rest well. Good night.